At Home with the Zen Gateway for today, which is the 28th of April. Okay, I think we are just waiting to see if anybody's going to be coming online. If you can see and hear me, either click like or you can just put a comment in the box. That'd be cool. Okay, I think people are coming in. Hello, Steve. Hi. Good. All right. That's cool. We'll just give it a minute for people to come in. Good morning. Good morning. That's lovely. Carolyn, Chris, lovely. All right. David, hi. Good morning. That's lovely. Okay, just to say, we are back with our Wisdom of the Zen Masters. It's raining a lot here, so I've put the headphones on because I thought it might cut out some of the noise here in the conservatory of the rain. And hopefully the internet will be playing ball for the duration. And we can enjoy our part from the book today. Okay, I think we'll kick off now. So, Master Shaku Soen liked to take an evening stroll through a nearby village. One day he heard loud lamentations from a house, and on entering quietly, realized that the householder had died, and the family and neighbors were crying. He sat down and cried with them. An old man noticed him and remarked, rather shaken on seeing the famous master crying with them, "I would have thought that you were at least beyond such things." "But it is this which puts me beyond it," replied the master with a sob. So that's our story. Master Shaku Soen was a Zen master who lived and his sort of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. So just coming into the modern period, as it were. And here there's a few points that are rather good, because today I wanted to look at going a little bit deeper into what's called working with the emotional household. Last week we began looking at that subject, and today I really wanted to go into it a little bit more and perhaps answer some questions around what does it look like when we actually work with the emotional household? Because we talk a lot about transformation of the energies of the heart. What does it look like when someone has gone through the process? And this is the thing. The master, Soen Shaku, as it were, represents an idealized form of something. Obviously, being a master is expected to, as it were, have a grip on the practice and to have been changed, transformed by it. So this was why the householders seemed surprised, because the householder's expectation of what a master looks like wasn't being met. And that's why he expressed surprise. So we need to look at this a little bit more and see what is the difference between the householder who was crying and the master who was crying. Well, I think one thing just to make clear, particularly when it comes to Buddhism, obviously there's a lot of talk about desire and the passions and fear and so forth, and then, as it were, passing beyond such states. And normally, because of the language that we use, it sounds very much as if somehow people who've been through this practice and perhaps have become skilled in the practice of daily life practice, or mindfulness as it's sometimes called, are somehow different orders of human beings to the rest of humanity, to the rest of us. And this, time and time again, they make very clear is not the case. It's something more subtle than that. And one thing that's important is that even though the ordained monks and nuns, the Sangha as it's called, even in the Buddha's time, remove themselves from the life of the householder and went out and lived in the forest, mainly on their own, in sort of small, quite loose communities. This didn't mean that they could live apart from society. And the Buddha was very clear in making sure that they couldn't do that. And that was why one of the rules that all Buddhist monks and nuns had to obey in the early years, and some still hold very much to it now, is that they couldn't handle money, and neither could they work. And that is, they couldn't work for money. They can work, they do work, but they don't work for money. And that was done deliberately to make them entirely dependent upon the community. And in that way, they couldn't separate themselves from it. Being dependent upon the community meant that they couldn't just abandon, human life altogether. Because what the Buddha didn't want to produce was some kind of cold human being who had somehow artificially risen above, the cares of the world. Because what good is that to everybody else? If you're so removed from the cares of the ordinary world, then how can you empathize with such a world? Where is the compassion in that? It's cold. It's inhuman. In fact, and the Buddha was full of warmth, full of compassion, and that compassion comes from the experience of life and the woes of life in particular. And I think probably the most ideal story to show this is that relatively well-known story of Kisagotami, who was a young woman who had suffered great losses already, and all she had left in life was her baby. And then finally the baby took sick and died, and that for Kisagotami was the straw that broke the camel's back, and therefore something just broke in her, quite naturally. And now this was in India, obviously, at the 500 BC, time of the Buddha, and funerals happen very quickly after someone's died. But she wouldn't put the baby down. She couldn't let the baby go, and so the elders of the village were very worried by this, and they pleaded with her. But she was convinced that somebody could be able to bring her baby back to life or make her baby well. So the elders sort of said in desperation, well, why don't you go and see the Buddha? And so she did, and she knelt before the Buddha and explained the situation. And the Buddha, knew perfectly well that he couldn't bring the baby back to life. That was beyond his power. But he also couldn't just abandon her as well. And so he adopted a skillful means. And so he told her, he said, well, he didn't say, yes, I will, or no, I won't. He said, well, I may be able to help. He said, but I'll need you to go and get 3 mustard seeds for me. And of course, she was immediately up and running out the door when he shouted after her, but they must come from a household where no one has ever died. Yes, 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 she said, and off she ran. Well, of course, in India at that time, people didn't move around so much. You tended to inherit the house of your forefathers. So many generations had lived in every household. It wasn't like now where we sort of move into a new Barrett's home, etc. At that time, it was intergenerational. And of course, she went to every household, and it became very, very clear that in every household, someone had died, and often quite recently. Obviously, mortality rates of the old and the young was very high, perhaps unlike now, where our mortality is much lower. And when people die, it frightens us as much as we grieve. It also frightens us as well. There, death was much more visible, of course, and so it was only at the very end of the day, because she went from household to household through the whole town and then on to the next town, and it was only fatigued and tired at the end of the day she came back to the Buddha, and finally she was able to kneel down before him, lay down that little bundle that she had been carrying all that time, and say, now I understand the teaching of the Blessed One. I am not alone in my suffering. The story ends really sort of movingly. The Buddha stretches out his hands and places them on her head, and silently, and tears roll down his cheeks as well. Because what can you do? And I think when I first heard that story, I was very moved by it, because there was no sort of, magical, miraculous ending, which would have cheated, really, because, the rest of us, we don't get a miraculous end, do we? We get old age, sickness, and death, and that's the truth. And it was those words uttered by Kisa Gotami, I am not alone in my suffering. So he didn't attempt to take away her grief, because he couldn't. What he did was he reconnected her back with the rest of humanity, because that is what grief does. When we are suffering, or when I am suffering, I feel misunderstood. I feel cut off from the rest of society. I feel that those things that brought me pleasure before, no longer do. Maybe people, I mean, in a small way, maybe people are feeling that now, because it's not just other people that we grieve for. It's not just the deceased that we grieve for, but also, our expectations we grieve for, our ambitions and hopes and dreams we can grieve for if somehow they're snatched away. So, we experience grief and loss through all of these things. And of course, when that happens to me, I feel very isolated and disoriented. And so we going through that process to get to the point, as the Buddha helped Kisa Gotami to recognize that, in fact, this is the common human lot, and we are all in the same boat. And when that happens, a new dimension opens out on our suffering. It doesn't take it away. That's the important thing. And when the Buddha says, suffering I teach, and the way out of suffering, whilst we are alive in the world, there's always going to be pain. But the attitude we take towards it conditions how we experience that pain. And it's really important to understand that. And interestingly, I mean, cognitive scientists now, cognitive therapists now work on that principle. They recognize that our experience is conditioned through the mindsets that we adopt to it. And really the most important mindset is to be able to, link up again when we have become disconnected. That acts as a salve. So that was the story of Kisa Gotami. So I mean, perhaps in its most extreme way, a parent does not expect a child to die before the parent. So when that happens, there's a sort of breakdown of the natural order. There's an expectation that this is what should happen, and when it doesn't, it feels like an affront. And again, that can happen in very mild ways, in very small ways. And when we're working with the emotional household, there's no point waiting until some huge catastrophe happens, and then we sort of think, oh, I suppose I better start working with the emotional household. It's important to start now with the small everyday things. You break a favorite coffee mug. It's not end of the world grief, but it's a disappointment. It was something that it was your mug, and it gave you you like to drink your coffee out of it, and now it's broken in pieces. You didn't expect that, but it happened. And I do remember a story someone told in the Zen group after a session, after one of the retreats. And in those days, it was when Venerable Myokyoni was still alive. And she was on the same table as Myokyoni, and she was sat opposite her on the table. There's a table of 6 people. And for some reason, she got it into her head. There is no such rule, but she got it into her head that if she sat opposite Myokyoni, she had to copy her and put on her plate exactly what Myokyoni put on her plate. Now, it so happened that for that week, Myokyoni had an upset stomach, and so she was eating very little because it upset her digestion. And the food at the priory is plentiful and very nice, and a lot of it's homegrown as well, homegrown veg. And in a session where everything else is restricted, the one thing you have control over is how much food you can put on your plate. And she was under this woman was under this constraint, this idea that she had. And so she went through day 1 and day 2 and day 3. And she said she got to day 4. She got to the lunchtime, and it was something that she really liked. And Myokyoni again took a small portion. And she sat there, she said, absolutely fuming. And inside she felt, but I have a right to this food. And in that moment, and it's amazing how the Dharma works sometimes, at that moment, that plea, that voice sort of broke open And she realized that, of course, she didn't have a right. um, you have to ask yourself, where did that idea come from? The idea that came into her mind that sort of said, you have to eat the same as Miyokyo. Absolutely. And it came at just that time as well. And it sort of seemed to, as it were, direct her towards that insight that she had when she recognized that actually she didn't have a right. Because for her, that right, what she called a right, was an expectation. It's what I want. And this is why the Buddha tied together grasping, desire arises. I grasp at something, and when the world then comes along and won't let me have what I want, or puts me together with something that I don't want, they're both forms of desire, then I suffer as a consequence. It's that inability to be able to let go. Now, on the other hand, this is then where the mistake comes at, where I begin to think, oh, well, in that case, I shouldn't have desire, and sometimes that can happen. There are people, for example, who have been, I can think of a few, I'm sure we all can, people who've been stung in love, for example. They've had a relationship and they were betrayed, or they were really badly hurt. And then after that, they find it very difficult to allow themselves to fall in love again because of that hurt. And that can happen, and not just in love, that can happen throughout life. And there are some people who have learned, not to trust their desires for one reason or another, not to trust their feelings, and as such they mute them, and they can mute them to the point where they in fact don't really feel them anymore. And there's a sort of, these things get swept under the carpet. And, that there are many reasons why we might actually do that. We may sweep a desire under the carpet because it's socially unacceptable, perhaps to the people we live with, our family or our friends, for example. So we push it down because, losing face, or we're frightened of being judged by others, for example, and we're frightened of approbation of others. So there's many reasons why we might repress something, but of course, we can do that for a while. Human beings, this human psyche has the capacity to be able to repress. But of course, what happens by sweeping things under the carpet is that they don't go away. I mean, the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung said, just because you can't see something doesn't mean it can't influence you. In fact, quite the opposite. And this is where Freud's notion of the unconscious comes in. Our unconscious desires influence us even, unbidden. And they can cause us trouble as well, cause us to do things that to act out of character. And quite often, when an energy like that has been repressed for a long time, it can become quite volcanic. Interestingly, rather like in the middle of the lockdown, there are people saying, "Oh my God, once the pubs open, I'm going to live there." And they probably will be that. There'll be queues around the doors for the hairdresser and the restaurant. All those things that I have wanted and have been denied all these weeks. Now, boom, and there'll be this period, as it were, of overshoot, and then finally, it's sort of, the energy dies down and it will no doubt come back to normal. And, hopefully it won't be too destructive, and it will be okay. And who knows, maybe even the economy will need it. But whatever happens, there is that sort of, repression, and then there's an equal and opposite a reaction that sort of happens a little bit later. So actually what we're after, what we're moving towards is what is called the middle way. The middle way, in the case of working with the fires, is to be able to contain it so that the impulses don't explode out all over the place, so that every single little impulse that comes up that may be denied, that I don't fall to pieces and doesn't become troublesome and irksome to other people, because we do live within the precepts. We do live within the precepts of causing as little harm to others as necessary. However, on the other side, on the inside, there is to be full acknowledgement of what we feel. There is to be no denial of any feeling that comes up. So there's this there's this balance. There is this middle way between the opposites of acting impulsively and repressing it, acting impulsively and repressing it. And this is the middle way. It's what the great master Hakuin summed up, and that this is really the key to this story of Shaku Soen, when he said, laugh, but not to be carried away by laughter. Cry, but not to be carried away by tears. And if we want a sort of paradigm, or an ideal, if you like, or a mantra for working with the fires, then let it be that: to laugh, but not to be carried away by laughter; to cry, but not to be carried away by tears. And what does that mean? It means because when the passions take me over, there is a narrowing of consciousness. We become entranced by it. We become carried away by it. We become either ignorant of or careless of the outcome of acting impulsively in that time. We become carried away. It's like people when they're drunk. It's the same sort of thing. We become so immersed in our own feeling, so immersed in our own enjoyment, that if somebody comes up and says, "Do you mind not making so much noise?" We get upset by it. But if we're keeping the street awake at 12:30 at night, then of course people are going to complain. We know that. But in that moment, we don't care, or we are ignorant of it, and we don't want to know either. So it's that loss of perspective. So the Buddha's advice on working with the fires is just this: to live life fully. This is why we give ourselves wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done, but with a lightness of touch, to be able to let go when the time to let go has been called. And then move on to the next thing and give ourselves wholeheartedly into that. And this is the middle way. This is the middle way that is really needed. And there are things that stop us doing that. Usually what stops us doing that are either my expectations or those unconscious desires as well. Our unconscious motivations of which we're blind. And perhaps we can sort of finish on this point. Again, I remember Venerable Myokyoni mentioning once that when she was living in and training in Japan, she knew a woman there who was a real do-gooder. She was, but not in a good sense. It was sort of interfering and, always, and just rather obsequious. And there was something, she just said, there was something disingenuous about it. It's something that just sort of rubbed you up. It was overbearing. And then one day, this woman was mugged violently in the street, and she was hospitalized. And when she recovered and she came back, she was changed. That do-gooding had gone, but she said, when she spoke with a genuineness which had not been there before. And really the difference is between before and after is that woman had really suffered, and it was her own suffering that gave her an insight into the suffering of others. And that's what made her genuine after that. So our suffering is important. Again, we don't have to seek it out and beat ourselves up. Life will do that for us in its own way. But it is important to allow ourselves to feel it. Again, Soko Morinaga Roshi once said that it is most important when we suffer that we drink it down to the last drop. Again, this is not a masochistic thing. It's to really open up to it and to experience the hurt that we have, because that wound is what permits us to feel the warmth of the compassion, as Kisa Gotami did, in recognizing that I am not alone in my suffering. Okay, well, I think we'll finish the talk for today there. No doubt we will return to this topic in the future. So there we go. So if anybody has any questions or any comments or anything, do by all means put them in the comment box and we will see. Oh, there we go. Dushika, morning from sunny Slovenia. I didn't see that comment. How lucky you are. Good morning from sunny Scotland as well, from Maggie. Hello, Maggie. Yes, you're doing very well. We've got the rain for a change. Gosh, yes. So that's good. Okay. All right. Well, um, what I would say is actually because obviously this talk is, as you know, recorded and will appear on the Zen Gateway timeline. If anybody, well, a couple of things. If anybody has any particular subject or topic that you would like covered, then hi Jackie. If then please, just add a comment underneath, and I'll do my best to weave it into whatever story we happen to be doing. One other thing as well, as you know, on the Zen Gateway, by the way, if you've not seen the Zen Gateway, do go over to thezengateway.com, www.thezengateway.com, which is our magazine, our online magazine. It's all free. Sign up for the newsletter. You just get the newsletter once a week, by the way. But once a month, we do what's called Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice. And if we always welcome good questions from people who are training or practicing meditation and mindfulness. Problems that you have are faced by other people. So please do send me your question. You can. Probably the best thing to do is to just email me at thezengateway@gmail.com. The Zen Gateway at gmail.com. So if you have any questions, and then what I do is once a month, I'll pick a question or two, I'll answer them and then put it out as a podcast. And that way everyone can benefit from it. So do feel free. Okay. Okay. There doesn't seem to be any particular questions at the moment. Good. I'm glad that we haven't lost reception this time. I was a bit worried. The weather sometimes makes a difference. Okay. We'll say emotions can be physically uncomfortable. Makes it difficult to sit with them. Is just practice and yeah. Okay. So one question: emotions can be physically uncomfortable. Yes, they most certainly can be, because the emotions happen to us in the body. That is where they're rooted. Although we're used to thinking of emotions, our thoughts and painful thoughts or whatever, actually the feeling of them is in the body, and therefore that's the place to tackle them. We cannot think our way out of an emotional state. So yes, absolutely. Again, to use an example Venerable Myokuni used to use, I don't know, you may have to use your own creativity to adapt this. But she used to say whenever she used to get upset or into a bit of a mood or whatever, that sort of mood that you can't quite shake off, she used to keep a pile of socks that needed darning, because, as she put it herself, I hated sewing as a girl. So she thought, if I felt in a rotten mood, what do you have to lose? You can't feel any worse. So she said, I used to take that energy and I would get the darning needle, the thread, and the socks, and I would darn, she said, like the devil. And she said at the end of the process, the energy had worked itself out through the physical act itself, and you had a nice pile of neatly darned socks. And as she always said, no one can darn like the devil. So it may, I mean, we can use bowing or whatever, but yeah, it sort of depends. If we're feeling lethargy or a bit depressed, then sometimes we just have to, as it were, go and clean the kitchen cupboard. Don't overdo it. This is not to avoid it. And interestingly, I saw Maria Elena was there. Maria, who I know, who reminds me of, because I know she's very active in the Jungian book club. And it reminds me of something that Carl Jung himself did, which was when he was going through his own period of breakdown in the early part of the 20th century, and he was documenting it all, and he was doing a lot of his own version of a meditation called the active imagination, which is when he was really developing the process. He would use yoga. He said when the whole thing became too overpowering, he would use yoga to just calm it down enough, but wouldn't stop it. And again, if we keep that sort of middle way in mind, it's to sit with it in the body. If it becomes too overwhelming, then in a way we need to discharge a little bit of that. power, a little bit of that energy, but not too much. It's important that we don't turn the yoga or whatever it is into an avoidance of it. It's to be able to sit with it, to really be able to come together with it. It's a skill. It's a skill, and it's one that we develop through practice. Okay, I hope that helps. Right. Okay, that's 11:45. I think we will call it a day. Thanks very much for joining me again, and all being well, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.